everyone. Hi, welcome to our Lunch and Learn, our December Lunch and Learn. My name is Joyska Nunez Medina, and I work in community engagement here at the Tennessee State Museum. And, welcome. This is our last Lunch and Learn for the year. Thank you to everyone who's been joining us in the past year. And today we have Jack Neely here with us from the Knoxville History Project, and he will be talking to us about how the influenza epidemic of 1918 and World War I came to impact Christmas traditions in Tennessee and in Knoxville, which is very interesting and exciting. Thank you for joining us today.
Are you talking about? Yes, thanks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Before we also get started, a few housekeeping tips. Morgan Byrne is here today. She's our tech. If you need any help, you can pull up the chat on the bottom right-hand side and send a message to her. If you have any questions at any point for Jack, you can send them in and make sure to have it listed to all panelists. That way we can ask the questions at the end during our Q&A. So we're excited to have you today. You're kind of like the unofficial historian of Knoxville, and I've heard so many great things from you. So I'm really excited to hear your presentation today.
Well, thanks very much. Yes, to introduce myself, I'm kind of a lifetime journalist. I was a journalist for over 30 years. And about 6 years ago, as journalism patterns started changing here, I started a nonprofit called the Knoxville History Project. It's the first organization devoted to the history of the city of Knoxville. We also have the wonderful East Tennessee Historical Society and work with them a lot. But we're just all about Knoxville, which has its own history, which is related to its region, but not the same thing exactly. And a few months ago, Rachel Helvering at the museum asked me she read a story that I wrote about Christmas in 1918 and asked me to give a talk about that. And that was our last pandemic Christmas. I can understand why it would be interesting. And every Christmas is pretty fascinating. I've been writing about Christmases 100 years ago, since 1992. So I've kind of covered a whole era, the late Victorian and like almost into the modern era with this series. But 1918 was unique in some ways, and I think in some ways was the first modern Christmas. It was the last pandemic Christmas. It was especially dramatic in lots of ways. It was because it was during World War II, right after World War I, actually, right after the Armistice. And was our first modern Christmas in some ways. I wrote the story called "Again the White Lights Winked," which you can read in its entirety on our website, knoxvillehistoryproject.org. But I want to talk a bit about the history of Christmas in Knoxville and in Tennessee. And for context, there are a good many surprises in there. I think even if you've studied the subject, it's something that's fascinating and unexpected in many ways. But also I want to touch on the history of pandemics in Tennessee, which I think has a bit of relevance to how people reacted to the Spanish flu of 1918. But to the early settlers, and this is hard to imagine, but 200 years ago, 220 years ago, the early settlers of Tennessee, to them, Christmas was a foreign thing. If you ask, how did William Blount and John Sevier celebrate Christmas? The fact it probably is that it probably never crossed their minds. As far as we know, they never commemorated Christmas in any way in Tennessee in the 1790s. I don't doubt that some people did, but basically Protestants, for the most part, had no tradition of Christmas celebrations in America. Many Americans thought of it as a foreign holiday, kind of like Oktoberfest or something. Or in some cases had never heard of it at all. Fundamentalists would say, well, there's nothing about December 25th in the Bible. Why should we celebrate? There's no suggestion that we should celebrate that, so we're not going to do it. And it was actually banned, you may know, in earlier eras in Massachusetts. It was considered an old world holiday, a corrupt pagan holiday, and you could actually be punished for celebrating Christmas in Massachusetts in the 1600s. But basically, in this part of the country, most people have just hardly even heard of it. And I've in my research in the 1790s, the earliest days of the state, I've often seen the date December 25th in big bold letters. And it's not for a holiday. December 25th was often the day that debts came due. It was a regular working day, but December 25th, people just made an announcement: you better pay us by December 25th, and we won't sue you. It was about a week before the end of the year, and that was just a handy day to remember that you needed to pay all your debts of the year. But culture spreads, interestingly, like a pandemic in a way. There are different kinds of culture. One is microbial culture, and one is the culture of ideas. And in a way, Christmas came upon us kind of like an epidemic does, a nicer epidemic. But what made Tennessee start celebrating Christmas is especially interesting. I think there are two especially well-known pieces of literature that had a lot to do with Christmas. By the way, I'll be showing some slides later on, but I would like to just go and tell the story first. But in 1819, 1820, there was a book that was in almost every literate Tennessee household in short order. It was a book by Washington Irving called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, an odd name for a great collection of stories that changed American culture in many ways. Washington Irving, of course, was a New York area writer, but was this one book contains the story of Rip Van Winkle, the guy who slept for 20 years and woke up and tried to deal with the modern world, with the legend of Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane and the Headless Man. All these stories come out of this one book, but in this book, a lot of people don't realize there are 5 stories about Christmas, and these were stories based on his historical research into the English Christmas. He spent some time in England researching not the way people in England in 1820 were celebrating Christmas, but what they did in medieval times, and he was kind of fascinated with this idea of the giant feast and the gift-giving celebrations and all the different kinds of food and drink that they had Christmas time, and wrote these essays about Christmas that fascinated people. He even taught English people something about their own culture, because later on another writer would refer to Washington Irving's research as an inspiration. But he really introduced to America the idea that Christmas was an interesting and fun thing that was once celebrated and maybe could be celebrated again. And after the publication of this book, there's a flurry of interest across America in Christmas. You see more. This is about this time that A Visit from St. Nicholas, the poem, was written and published up north. There was a few mentions of Christmas in Tennessee. Once or twice, it was a day off for some people, but not that big a deal. But then it kind of died out again. I think by the 1830s, we weren't paying much attention to Christmas. But then there was an avalanche of Christmas in the 1840s, and this was due to a couple of things. One was a massive immigration of refugees from 2 very different disasters in Europe. And one was the German revolutions of 1848, which were idealistic democratic revolutions that were put down brutally. And there were things were worse after the revolutions than they had been before for a lot of people who were not aristocrats. We had, I think, more than 1 million Germans came across the ocean to America, not just from Germany, but from Austria, from Hungary, from Italy. All these people were affected by these revolutions and came here. You may know that Wartburg in Tennessee in Morgan County was established as a German colony for these refugees who came over. And a lot of the early settlers of Wartburg, who called it Wartburg in the early days, were members of this group. A lot of them were unhappy with the situation they found in the Cumberland Mountains, and they got cold in the winter, and it was very far from a lot of amenities. So a lot of these, maybe most of these refugees who landed in Wartburg moved to either Nashville or Knoxville, and changed the cultures that they of those cities when they brought to them. So many traditions that the Germans brought. They brought classical music. They brought beer, and they brought Christmas trees. These were all three things that were things we might have heard of, but were not common, and certainly not common in Tennessee before the Germans arrived. I think almost all of the breweries I know of in Tennessee from this era are run by people with German last names. But the other disaster besides the Revolution of 1848 was at the same time, almost exactly, and that was the Irish famine, the potato famine. And again, we had about more than 1 million people from Ireland coming here, just people who were starving to death, couldn't make a living in Ireland. And they came here, and they moved all over the country. They came to Knoxville to work on the railroad. So we had a place called Irish Town back then, but they brought their own Christmas traditions with them as well. They were Catholics, and they celebrated Christmas. And here in the Protestant areas, we thought of Christmas again as a Catholic holiday, but as when we began seeing the Irish celebrate it with all these masses that they had on Christmas Day, it was something that we may have envied a bit. But anyway, there were all this was going on at the same time as another piece of literature was published by a guy named Charles Dickens, who later noted that he was inspired partly by Washington Irving's writings about the English Christmas when he wrote a story called A Christmas Carol. And this Dickens was well known in Tennessee, as we know, from Pickwick Dam is named for the town of Pickwick, which is named for Pickwick Papers, a Dickens novel. I mean, everybody, and even people who didn't consider themselves intellectuals or whatever, knew Charles Dickens' work. This was very much part of Tennessee, became part of Tennessee culture as well. But when he published this book called A Christmas Carol, suddenly everybody in America read it and were inspired by it, and nobody in America wanted to be like Ebenezer Scrooge. Up until this time, most people worked on Christmas Day. Christmas Day
Excuse
was
me, Jack?
Yeah.
We can't see your video.
Yeah, I don't know. It went off for some reason. Okay. All right, it's back again, I guess. I didn't touch it. It just went off. Okay.
Yes,
all right,
you're good.
Yeah, I'll check. If that happens again, I'll correct myself. All right. But anyway, this was Dickens' Christmas Carol, it was published in America in 1844 and had an enormous impact on all of America. I see references to it in Knoxville right away, and it shows how closely people were watching, were reading Charles Dickens in those days. But these were all these were two the combination of the German immigrants, the Irish immigrants, and the publication of A Christmas Carol, all of the same decade, in the 1840s, I think got Tennessee to celebrate Christmas in many cases for the first time. But it flowered after the Civil War. You start to see a few mentions of Christmas as a gift-giving holiday just before the Civil War, in Knoxville and other places. But after the Civil War, it really flowers. You start seeing images of Santa Claus. There's another German thing, and I don't know if anybody knows Kern's bread. It was a very popular bread in East Tennessee for for a century or more than a century. But the guy that founded Kern's bread was one of these German refugees. Peter Kern, his name was. He was once mayor of Knoxville. Our last mayor with a foreign accent was Peter Kern. But he loved Christmas and kind of helped us learn to celebrate Christmas, and also to advertise his bakery. He used the first image I know of Santa Claus I've ever seen and published in the Knoxville papers in 1868, I think. But about the 1870s, Christmas was a well-established holiday in Tennessee. It was a day off, but it was associated with drinking, and considering cities like Knoxville and probably Nashville as well had new factories and things that were growing rapidly, and lots of single young men from all over the country were moving into these cities, looking for work in the factories and the wholesale houses. And some of them were post-traumatic Civil War veterans, of course. And this sounds like a recipe for trouble, and certainly was in the 1870s. Really, for about 40 years, Christmas week was a time of fighting, of riots, of murder. Our murder rate was, I'm confident in saying, always higher in Christmas week than it was any other week of the year. There were Christmas, especially Christmas Eve, was associated with dangerous pranks and vandalism, like greasing streetcar tracks to cause Christmas Day wrecks, some of which resulted in injuries. And it was a time for fireworks. It was just people loved to blow things up. Any holiday in Tennessee, I think almost every holiday except perhaps Easter has a tradition of being associated with fireworks. And this was certainly the case with Christmas, especially Christmas Eve. It was no kind of silent night, and often these fireworks caused fires. The worst case of this in Knoxville was in 1893 when we experienced a series of riots that was known as the Saturnalia, going back to the old pagan name for the solstice holiday. And buildings were set on fire. Policemen who were trying to put it down were seriously injured. The mob ruled the city for a few days in this time. It was almost the definition of misrule, which is interesting as an old medieval idea of Christmas. Misrule, this idea of chaos and celebrating chaos and things being upside down and backwards. And that was, in some ways, it's fascinating that it went through the same cycles that Tennessee in Tennessee that had gone through in Europe centuries before Christmas. I don't know what it is about Christmas that has to go through this period of chaos before it emerges as something else. But it remained that settled down a good deal. There were a good many ordinances. We banned fireworks in Knoxville for the first time after 1893. We doubled the police watches on Christmas Eve. This was something. Christmas was always a time that you gathered as many police. You had double force of police looking around the city for trouble, and it was and all these new ordinances kind of tamped it down some, but it remained a very public holiday in a way that it's not now. There's a very big public Christmas tree. We still have that in a lot of our cities. But on Christmas Day, there were extra vlog shows, special shows. There were the religious always went to church on Christmas Day. Almost all the churches had services on Christmas Day. Like the Catholic Church had 3 masses on Christmas Day. And this is surprising. The Germans were especially interested in bowling, and they had bowling tournaments in Knoxville all day on Christmas Day. I don't know if this was something that was just in Knoxville or elsewhere, but until midnight on Christmas Day, it was the biggest bowling championship of the year. That was a very big deal, and the fact that many of the people's last names were German, I think, makes me think it was more of a part of the German culture than other cultures. But it was but there were masquerade parties. There were Christmas dances on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. There were lots and lots of kind of public and semi-public events in a way that we don't have in the same way. Okay, I want to just mention something because we're talking about the other kind of culture, which is microbial culture. Talk a bit about epidemics and that a very different subject, but it's part of the context to understand Christmas in 1918. I'm convinced that people in 1918, especially older people, were a bit inured to fatal epidemics. There had been epidemics, very serious epidemics throughout history. We had an epidemic here in 1838 that killed 1/10 of all the population, all the people who lived in Knoxville. We still don't know exactly what it was. Might compare that to COVID, that even after the recent spike, I think the total fatalities are about, here in Knox County, are about 1/20th of 1%. And that's still scary. I don't want to diminish that, but the people who'd been through worse epidemics, I think, they brought a certain perspective to the so-called Spanish flu of 1918. In 1918, a lot of older Tennesseans remember the last cholera epidemics. A lot of people don't realize we had cholera epidemics. We had 3 of them here in Knoxville, and they were deadly and horrible. It was a horrible way to die, cholera. But typhoid and more recently smallpox, we had kind of a permanent what they call a pest house, kind of a concentration camp for smallpox victims on the east side of town, out in the woods in Knoxville, because we wanted to get them away from town as quick as we could, and they either got well by themselves or they died. And that area in the woods is still full of sunken spots where they had quick burials of smallpox victims. But the smallpox was about 30% fatal, compared to flus, which are, I think the Spanish flu was about 2%. It was the deadliest flu ever, but it was only 1 in 50 people who got it died. It was probably deadlier than COVID, certainly in terms of per capita or per week terms. But I think people were more stoic because of the fact that they'd all survived epidemics in the past. In 1918, the Spanish flu began as a rumor. It was getting around. It hit Knoxville in late September, and everybody was first, again, kind of denial about it. Even the city doctor was saying, this isn't really the flu you've heard about in Europe, and it's killed so many people elsewhere. But it was only a few days before he realized that it was, and people were dying here, especially young soldiers. And the odd thing about Spanish flu was it wasn't killing the old people in the nursing homes. It was killing young people. It was killing children and youthful people, young soldiers first. But we had several hundred soldiers who were training here to go to Europe, and it seems to have started in their camps. It peaked in October. When almost 200 died in Knoxville alone. I know that other cities in Tennessee had it worse than Knoxville did. I think Nashville lost about 400 people that month, and Chattanooga had it worse as well. But during this, we had a city physician who somehow was endowed with dictatorial powers, and he shut down, just by his own decision, shut down the theaters and the churches. Bam. And the churches try to make the best of it. I ran across a poignant sermon by a Presbyterian minister that was published in the paper. He said, instead of having one big church service, we're going to have 10,000 church services this Sunday, because every Christian in Knoxville is going to be having their own church services in their own house with their family. They didn't call them pods back then. That's what we call them now. But that was it was impressive how quickly Knoxville adjusted to this scary new epidemic. But we closed the theaters, churches. We closed the Tennessee Valley Fair, which is already underway. And the city doctor, Dr. Cochran, for bad groups, we talk about groups of more than 10 are off limits. To Dr. Cochran, he said the only safe thing is to have only groups of 2 or less. That was his edict for Knoxville. If you got 3 people on Gay Street together in downtown Knoxville, they could be arrested for being an illegal gathering of people. He closed down everything except for one thing. He said, I can't close down patriotic events. And there was a Liberty Bond drive. And this was considered to be very important to the war effort, to sell Liberty bonds. And they were expecting a giant crowd. They were having big vaudeville stars from New York and other places. And they were here, and they didn't want them to just go back home without raising some money for the war effort. So they had a giant Liberty Bond drive on Gay Street, a 3-block-long festival. They decided not to have it inside the theaters, which is what they were planning to do, but they put it out in the streets. And this may have been a fatal error, because the cases been raging already, really skyrocketed after this bond drive. The Spanish flu was the incubation period was much shorter than it is for COVID. So you saw the results of that just within 2 or 3 days after the bond drive. But in spite of all this, and who knows if it was herd immunity or what, but the worst of the flu seemed to subside around Halloween, just after about a month after it arrived, and they loosened the restrictions and stopped. They reopened the theaters in November, and by the time Armistice Day got here, the end of the war, end of World War I, there was a giant celebration downtown with thousands of people and this drunken parade going all over town. that seemed to have no effect on the on additional cases. The flu didn't completely end until for arguably 1920. There were people, various pockets of people catching the flu, and some of them dying in 1919. But the alarm was over. The worst of it was over before Thanksgiving. There was if you studied the World War I, you know that the worst of the war was at the very last. That horrible October for the flu here was the worst month of the entire war for Americans, at least, and in terms of dying on the battlefield. And this was the fiercest fighting, and that was the heroes of Sergeant York, and all this stuff all happened in October of 1918. And this was a time when hundreds of Tennesseans died just that one month. And every newspaper in Knoxville, I'm sure the same is true for every other city in Tennessee, had a roll of honor that people read first before they read the comics or anything else. They read the roll of honor, the lists of the wounded and the wounded, the seriously wounded, and the dead were listed, and they were still being even weeks and weeks after Armistice Day. We were still learning about people that we hoped were going to be coming home, but they had died back in the last weeks of the war. So this was a poignant and kind of a weird Christmas. By Christmas Day in 1918, about 300 soldiers had returned, but thousands were still away. Many soldiers wouldn't return until 1919. And about 200 wouldn't return at all from Knox County, and for Tennessee it was in the thousands. But there were either symbolically or hopefully there were empty seats at many Christmas Day dinner tables in 1918. Where that month there was it's always fascinating to go back to the past. They say the past is a different country, and you always have the feeling of visiting a different country sometimes when you go back to Tennessee 100 years ago, especially in the cities. In Knoxville, and I think this is probably true all over America, there was a fascination with Asian things, all things Asian. In 1918, the big thing to buy, mom or dad, was an imported silk kimono. These were very popular at the time. Chop suey was about to catch on in the years to come. But I was fascinated to see a familiar name on the movie theater marquees. In 1918, you see a lot of Charlie Chaplin, that sort of thing. We had, I think, 7 movie theaters in downtown Knoxville in 1918. And one name that you see a lot is that of Cesu Hayakawa, the famous Japanese actor that people my age remember from a great movie called Prisoner of Kwai, where he plays the bad guy, the Japanese guy in charge of all the prisoners. But he was a young romantic lead in 1918. This is surprising that this guy was the first Asian to play lead roles, and he was in 7 different movies that appeared in Knoxville in 1918. That's kind of surprising. To look back at motion pictures in the silent era, we think of ourselves as being more cosmopolitan than our ancestors, but you were more likely to see a movie about people of other cultures, people who didn't speak English, in the silent era, because they had movies about with Russian subjects and Japanese subjects and Arabic subjects, all these things with no English-speaking characters at all. That they were all portrayed by English-speaking people in Hollywood, but they were about other cultures. Today that wouldn't fly in Hollywood. We have to have at least one American or one English speaking person in the movie for it to get our attention. That was not true of our ancestors. But there was so much interesting Asian bric-a-brac, and there was in one downtown department store there was what was described as a Buddha-like figure called Kumbak, and it had this little rhyme that went with it. It said, "My name is Kumbak, I'm your friend, and this will be my prayer, that you shall see the one you love come back from over there." That gives me a chill. This is being sold to families who didn't even know whether their loved ones were coming back. They were just hoping for any sort of sign or whatever. They didn't know whether, and if they did come back, they wouldn't know whether to buy them a football, which football was really catching on in 1918, or an artificial leg, because we had who were killed, but also a different list of people who were permanently maimed by the war. But there are other things to buy. Sturkey's. I know that Sturkey's was over most of Tennessee. It was headquartered in Knoxville, well-known furniture store. They were famous for furniture, but they also kind of popularized phonograph recordings, because they were the first time a lot of people got cheap enough to buy phonographs was from Sturkey's. They had, I think, 60 stores all over the Southeast. But their main store was in downtown Knoxville. But for wealthy people in 1918, automobiles were catching on. We're sometimes buying these as Christmas gifts. And there was and it was at the same time that there's a great deal of new interest in the suburbs in 1918. The idea that you could live in a place without being able to having to be near a streetcar line to get to work. And this is funny. This is something you don't think about. Along with automobiles, there were accessories for automobiles. In 1918, automobiles, especially in wintertime, were really, really cold. It was painful to drive a car around. So they had these very heavy robes that were made just for motorists that people were buying to wear just in a car. That's something I'd never realized until I began reading advertisements about it. But in 1918, there was a convergence of new influences. There was new technology, for one thing. There was electric technology, especially. Electric lights in the teens were becoming much more and more versatile. You started seeing colored lights and strings of lights, and people realized they could use these instead of candles to decorate the Christmas tree. Much safer to decorate a Christmas tree with electric lights. These were catching on, and believe it or not, I thought this was probably a post-war phenomenon, but the idea of decorating your houses with electric lights along the eaves and so forth, they were doing this back in 1918. They were selling strings of lights to put on your house, and they were beginning of the decoration wars. I think is a century old probably at this point. But the idea was that you didn't have to go downtown to see these amazing spectacles, these holiday spectacles at the theaters or the big tree and all that. You could make your own spectacles at home. This was a new idea, and kind of one of the several factors that focused Christmas more at the home rather than in the downtown section. Also, there were wartime shortages that had a big effect on Christmas celebrations. For many years, people didn't even start thinking about buying Christmas gifts until the middle of December. It was just a very short shopping season. But during World War I, and by the way, William Gibbs McAdoo was President Wilson's Secretary of the Treasury during World War I, and he was in charge of the trains. He kind of commandeered the whole train system to help serve the war effort. And he realized that we had to move trains around to move troops and material for the war. So he said the Wilson administration pleaded with people, please do your shopping early, like it may be as early as October this year. And this is the first time I think that people really did any Christmas shopping before December. And of course, that became kind of the model in our time. But there was a somewhat less public celebration planned. There were so many young men overseas; they didn't have quite as much going on. There's so many shortages. There weren't as many public things downtown. The war, of course, was over several weeks before Christmas, but it was hard nobody knew that was what happened end on November 11th. So a lot of a lot of the planning that might have happened for public holiday celebrations didn't happen in 1918. But one good thing about 1918 was that food was no longer rationed, and suddenly bread, butter, cheese, sugar, these things that are elemental to Christmas cooking were suddenly more available than they ever had been. And you wonder, another thing that might have happened is the bowling events seem to have fizzled away. I don't know if there was anti-German sentiment, if the Germans were not coming out in public as proudly as before, had anything to do with it, or it may just be a coincidence. I don't know. But one big factor is that prohibition was more secure than ever. Tennessee had been going dry by degrees since the early 1900s. And I think Tennessee was officially banned production of alcohol in 1909, and then they had the bone dry law in 1917. So 1918 was probably the driest Christmas anybody could remember. And the new national prohibition was in the works and actually just passed nationally a few days after Christmas that year in 1919. But the saloons were closed. And because they were closed, people had nowhere to go but home. People stayed home and did their drinking or whatever. And because there were fewer people going to the saloons, there was less obvious excitement downtown. So there was less reason to go downtown except to shop. So I think in 1918, Christmas was more private than ever, more family oriented. But it remained different in some ways, and I mentioned it in the ways that it remained different. We had carolers on Christmas Eve. We don't, and these weren't necessarily people we knew. They're not prearranged. People would show up at your house on Christmas Eve, and it might be late, and you had to go out and maybe throw them a nickel or something. But we also had shopping. I'm sure this is true in Nashville and other places. A lot of people, we had shopping not just for the city, but for a giant region. We had people in Knoxville from Kentucky, from North Carolina, from Virginia even, coming to Knoxville on the trains to stay here for a few days at a hotel to go shopping for all this time and go home. But one thing that's interesting to me is that the time that we celebrate Christmas has shifted in the 20th century. That in 1918, people still got their Christmas tree on Christmas Eve. It wasn't the day after Thanksgiving or whatever. It was Christmas Eve. That was when they heaped all the Christmas trees in big piles on Market Square, and people brought them, took them home, and decorated the Christmas tree. And that was part of the Christmas Eve ceremony, was to decorate the Christmas tree. And it would be up for a couple of weeks. It would be up into January. So the Christmas season really didn't start until Christmas Eve. December 25th was really 24th was when the Christmas season started, and lasted for roughly the 12 days of Christmas. Although you don't see much reference to the actual 12 days, people still did have Christmas parties in early January 3rd or so. But for the most part, people decorated a Christmas tree at home, put presents under it, had a Christmas dinner, and sang lots of the same Christmas carols we knew today. In 1918, it was a very recognizable holiday, unlike what it had been 25 years earlier. I saw this lovely little description of Christmas in Knoxville in 1918. Knoxville forgot the plans for a League of Nations, forgot President Wilson's visit to France, forgot the approaching municipal election, forgot the little troubles and worries that are ever present, and began an old-fashioned celebration on Christmas Eve. But there are a couple of mentions that there's an empty seat at the table, though, just in case there was a surprise. Anyway, I have a few slides I'd like to show just quickly, kind of illustrating some of the things I've been talking about. Joyce, are you ready with those? Anybody that wants to read any of this, by the way, you got KnoxvilleHistoryProject.org. We have my story about Knoxville Christmas in 1918 and several other Christmas stories as well. This is about my organization and the Knoxville History Project, and we're open to all kinds of historical associations that have to do with the city of Knoxville. We're involved in have our fingers in lots and lots of pies. But feel free to stay in touch. I respond to emails almost usually the same day. So. By the way, on the left is our Catholic Church. That's the first Catholic church in East Tennessee, Immaculate Conception. I think the second one in the whole state of Tennessee, and that was where a lot of Catholic parishioners going to mass on Christmas morning got the attention of all the Protestants in the city. All right, next slide. All right, yeah, this is our website, KnoxvilleHistoryProject.org. I looked down Gay Street, which was a place that was very crowded, obviously at Christmas time. There's so many of these big department stores. They were there, again, not just serving the Knoxville population, but a multi-state area. People would come in on the trains and and shop here. And in the far distance, I mentioned Sturkey's earlier. You can actually see the Sturkey's headquarters sign at the very end of the street. I just noticed that just now. You see the streetcars leading down, the streetcar tracks leading down Gay Street. All right, next slide. All right, here's just a few. We've done some presentations about the Spanish flu over the years, and this is just one of our slides. Next one, please. Here's some of the early articles from the newspapers from October of 1918, which I said was the worst time of the flu of all. All right, next one. There are soldiers training in Knoxville, and as I say, a lot of they're training both at the UT campus, which was then just the Hill. That was the whole campus, and during this time, the Hill had a quarantine. You had to have permission to come or leave campus during the Spanish flu period in October of 1918, because a lot of the soldiers who had been camped there and training there came down with the flu first, and that was when Dr. Cochrane realized that yes, this was not the ordinary flu. This was serious. This picture was taken within days of the worst of the Spanish flu period. Next one. All right, here's the welfare house at Chilhowie Park, which was on the east side. That's another place that there are two places troops were training at Chilhowie Park, where we have the fair, and UT campus. Next one, please. Sorry, I'm going through these so fast. I want to be sure we finish on time. The Red Cross ladies, we had a very active Red Cross canteen in downtown Knoxville, many of them training these nurses to go overseas. And many of these women who were trained in Knoxville went overseas and started canteens on the battlefronts of Europe during this time. But they were the ones who, in fact, in those days during this flu, I think the nurses were the only ones who were wearing masks. But that was one difference between then and now. Next one, please. All right, this is the old Knoxville General Hospital. It was torn down back in the 50s, but this was overrun. This is our one main hospital in the city, and during the Spanish flu, it was packed to the gills. And in a case I hope we can avoid, if only narrowly, this year. That's such a great concern in 2020 is hospital capacity, and we went way over our hospital capacity in 1918 and built 2 or 3 hospitals in short order in the 10 years after the Spanish flu. And I think the Spanish flu had a lot to do with that. Next one, please. All right, here's the Armistice Celebration. I'll say that all caution to the winds at this point. This is after the Spanish flu, after the worst of the Spanish flu was over. People couldn't help themselves. They came out by the thousands and thousands and just clogged Gay Street. And watching this, the Hope clock, you can see in the background, that count down the minutes to 11 o'clock, which was the symbolic time that the war had ended. And it was when the celebration started in Knoxville as well. Next one, please. All right, here's some Christmas shots. This is an early shot, probably after 1918, of a roughly 1920s, early 30s car with an interesting exposure issue with the big public Christmas tree that stood on Market Street, very close to Market Square. Next one. All right, I mentioned this is Dickens, what a big effect Dickens had on Tennessee and Christmas. I think all suddenly by 1844 or 45, everybody knew who Ebenezer Scrooge was in Tennessee. It was a very popular story, and I think had a big effect on our continuing celebration of Christmas and our association with Christmas with the Victorian era. Next one, please. All right, I mentioned Peter Kern earlier. This is the original Kern's Bakery. I'm glad the building is still there. It's now the Oliver Hotel on Market Square. But this was the bakery that former German refugee and immigrant and also Knoxville mayor Peter Kern built this building in the 1870s. And he was our Father Christmas, more or less. He told us how to celebrate. He and his wife were a very jolly pair. They're almost like Santa and Mrs. Claus. Love Christmas and other holidays. But they had a lot of, they sold toys and candy and other things here, very and Christmas cakes and things, and done up in the German style. All right, next one. All right, here's an early depiction of Santa Claus. Knoxville will be my headquarters for East Tennessee this year. And this was from the year 1893, the year of the Saturnalia, the riots. They had the shoppers competing for street space with rioters. It was a crazy, crazy time. Next one, please. All right, here's another an interesting ad from 1918. Christmas presents for boys and girls. Shetland ponies at auction for high dollar. Just a way to promote a horse auction, I guess. Next one, please. That's, by the way, in the Old City area. Ira Johnson bicycles were the big thing in 1918. Bicycling was kind of the end of the big bicycling boom that had begun in the 1890s. I think by 1920 or so, people were driving cars more than riding bikes. But in 1918, bikes were very popular. Next one, please. All right, the Bijou Theater. A lot of people you may have been there, and one of Tennessee's oldest theaters. They dates back to 1907, and it's interesting that the Bijou Theater, a very lively place today on a good year. The Bijou Theater was closed for business in 1918, and is closed for business right now. It's been closed only twice for epidemics, twice, once in 1918, once in 2020. And then the Rex Theater on the left, that's just one of the several movie theaters. There are lots of small movie theaters along the same street in downtown Knoxville. Next one, please. And I mentioned Sturkey Brothers Records for Christmas. Sturkey Brothers sold furniture, and phonographs were big. They were big pieces of furniture, and they sold accessories for phonographs, which included records. In fact, Sturkey's even made some of the early records of Uncle Dave Macon and lots of folks, even the early 20s. Before the Bristol sessions, Sturkey was promoting country music by sending just buskers sometimes up to New York to make records that they could sell in all their 60 stores in the Southeast. And this was, they were pretty proud of that. Next one, please. And just another George's department store thing. And you see, I mentioned that the Asian fascination. It's a Japanese pagoda gift shop on the third floor. That this was, people were just, for whatever reason, fascinated with all things Asian. Asian gardens were popping up at this time as well. Next one, please. All right, Newcomers was another department store downtown run by a Jewish family, but they had made a big deal of Christmas and had the real Santa Claus in the basement. That same building, by the way, is now Mass General Store, and they still is still probably the most Christmassy building in Knoxville in 2020, most Christmassy store at least anyway. Just a funny little ad from back in that 1918, I think. Next. All right, I wanted to mention that a lot of people came into town, and you can see the Southern Station here. This is one of our two railroad stations at the time. But people would jam the trains every Christmas and just come to Knoxville and stay in hotels like the Hotel Atkin in the background. Was torn down in the 60s. The Hotel Watauga behind it, the Central Hotel on the left. There were all those big hotels, and that's not even counting the Hotel Farragut and the other ones on Gay Street. But these were just the railroad station hotels. They're packed with people, many of them just, like I say, shoppers who lived in Jellicoe or somewhere and just came down here for shop for a few days. Is that the last one? Check on the next slide. Yeah, that may be the last one. Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And if there are any questions, it's a fascinating and big subject. I realized I kind of folded 4-hour-long lectures into one today, because I've given talks about Knoxville and World War I, and talks about Knoxville and epidemics, and Knoxville and Christmas. I'm actually doing one. We're doing one next week. If you want to tune in, Knoxville History Project next week on Thursday at 6. We're going to be talking in more depth about the development of Christmas. At that weekly, we do a weekly thing. I'm at Knoxville Mayors this week and Knoxville Christmas next week. But are there questions out there? I would love to address any.
Yes, that was really, really interesting. I love social history and like cultural history, so all of that was just fascinating. Um, so you actually answered one of them because there were people asking about the Kern's bread factory and how that's spelled. You're getting some thanks in the chat. There's another question from Lisa Hyder asking, when did rural Tennessee start celebrating Christmas? And she
Yeah.
says something about her father who grew up in Overton County talking about Christmas.
That is a good question. We look at Dolly Parton specials and would think that you have the impression that this Christmas has been is much part of rural Tennessee is moonshine or something is, but it's rural Tennessee was actually a bit slower to catch on to Christmas. I've actually seen interviews with people who remember childhoods in the 1880s and 90s, and they said they'd never heard of Christmas. They didn't know that such a thing existed. But I think by 1900 or so, it was becoming a thing. And it's interesting that some of the older Christmas traditions in Knoxville, like fireworks, hung on in rural areas longer. And I've heard people and people I've talked to who said that growing up in the country that they always had fireworks on Christmas Eve. But it's that's an interesting question and harder to research, I guess, than city Christmases because there weren't newspapers necessarily covering these things. But the people who like some of the farm people who populated Market Square and were selling their wares, were coming down from the mountains and from up in Anderson County and other places, would come to Knoxville and sell wreaths and Christmas trees. Cedar trees, by the way, were the main Christmas tree 100 years ago. And farmers were bringing these in from the countryside. So the enterprising farmers knew about it pretty early on, and were able to make some money out of it.
That's really smart. Of course, they would have to know.
Yeah.
Someone was asking, do you know how much about how the food traditions changed over time?
That's I don't know that they have changed a whole lot. I think there was more goose in the 19th century, but basically we have a very old-fashioned Christmas dinner every year. I think the turkey was always part of it, ham and that sort of thing. It's surprising looking at what the hotels advertised though at Christmas time. The fancy hotels downtown, especially in the 1890s, and this is probably true everywhere, but the hotels put on a big show for Christmas and would have like 18-course meals with lots of French sounding dishes and things like this, and kind of elaborate exotic things. One thing we take for granted that we have fruit everywhere now, and for some reason fruit at Christmas time was a very big deal to get. There was a local guy named William Caswell, who same guy Caswell Park, the baseball field is named for, but was he had a grapefruit plantation in Florida, and Caswell grapefruits was a big deal, and they would be coming in at Christmas time, and all the fancier groceries had citrus fruit, especially at Christmas time in the very early 20th century, maybe before that. But that's I think making a big deal out of things that I think we've kind of become. Now we have grapefruit every day, and it was just more special back then at Christmas time.
Yeah, we did some research on that last year, and it's because citrus fruits are seasonal in Florida around wintertime. So
Yeah.
that was kind of like my understanding, people asking for that because Florida's not too far.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it was part of the grapefruits were part of the excitement of Christmas to our great grandparents.
Drew asks, what holiday traditions really permanently disappeared after 1918?
Oh, that's good. I mentioned bowling. I don't know of any bowling tournaments on Christmas Day anymore. But one, I don't see city fireworks much anymore. I don't see the kind of public drunkenness, which was such a big deal on Christmas Day, even during Prohibition, the early days of Prohibition. that's kind of faded. I think we've kept most of the good traditions, actually. I think most of the nice things have stayed. But that's a good question. I'll probably answer better in about an hour when I think about it more. But one thing is that the Christmas dances and things like that. That's something that if you have a Christmas dance, it's probably like on December 10th or something now. But back then they would have a Christmas dance sometimes on Christmas Day, and that would be the holiday was more concentrated. And that's I think the single biggest change is that that people shopped as early as November by 1918. But they were shopping for the Christmas season, which didn't start until December 24th. And the Christmas season was just this mad, nonstop series of parties and dances and dinners, and it's like a short festival of about 10 days or maybe the 12 days of Christmas long. So that's the biggest difference, I think, that we've gotten kind of used to the idea of being tired of Christmas even before Christmas Day arrives. and most people would say that Christmas ends like at 3 o'clock on Christmas Day, when in 1918 and before that, there was just the beginning of several days of Christmas.
All right. This is going to be the last question. Thanks to everyone sending in your comments and questions in the chat. I love all of the personal stories that people are sending in too. The last question is, how long was the 2-person maximum gatherings mandated in Knoxville?
Only for about 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah, that was kind of an emergency within an emergency thing. I think that was after when the numbers started spiking in the middle of October, after people realized it was a serious issue. And they could even be arrested for sneezing in the street without a handkerchief. That was an arrestable offense in 1918. So we worry about civil liberties now, but and everybody fell in line. Of course, it was a shorter time than we've dealt with. We've dealt with COVID for 9 months now, and this was just a period of about a month that we were dealing with the worst of the restrictions. But anyway, that has any other questions, feel free to write me at knoxvillehistoryproject.org. I'm happy to take emails, questions, and comments. I'm also interested in hearing any of your Christmas memories that you think are relevant to Tennessee history.
Well, thank you, Jack, for that really interesting presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined us for our last live virtual program this year.
Yeah, and join us for our we have Zooms every single week at Knoxville History Project, and you can talk about almost everything. So, and I'm grateful to be here. I love the Tennessee State Museum. I'm sorry I missed a chance to see it in March when I was in Nashville, and first there were tornadoes and then an epidemic. So I haven't been back since then, but I've heard great things about it. So yeah, appreciate everything I'll do.
We can't wait to have you. Just some closing statements from us, since this is our final live program of the year. 2020 has been a long year and a difficult year for all of us. And we at the Tennessee State Museum appreciate all of you that have been joining us for our various virtual programs throughout the year. Keep an eye out on our calendar on tnmuseum.org, as well as on our social media for programs in the new year. We hope that you have a happy and safe and healthy new year and holiday season, and we will see you in 2021.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Bye.